This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Gerard Baker, who is the editor of the Wall Street Journal and now editor at large. And he's written a book that I find interesting and very well written and very thought-provoking, and a lot of speaking of truth in it and fairness. And that's American Breakdown. And I hope you read this because you need to, people who listen to this. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack commentary, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. I wanted to jump in and continue this line of thought on our conversation here. You talk about one of the problems with this kind of advocacy media is exacerbated by the online world. And I quote you, I think, from page 236, giving subscribers who more and more of the revenues to giving subscribers who supply more and more of the revenues to big news organizations exactly what they want has created a dangerous cycle in which newspapers and other media chase more revenue by appealing more and more to the most partisan audience. And, that's one reason I seek out people from the Wall Street Journal or people who are writing for, points of view that represent what, quote unquote, my followers don't agree with, because this is precisely what I don't want to do, is create another little bubble that only makes everybody comfortable who tunes into what I say. But that's not why I brought that up. I brought that up so you can take that further and just talk about how you feel, because you have a very good section on big tech. I just think it's fabulous. It's worth the price of the book, amongst other things. But how does this universe, because you and I didn't grow up with cell phones, and I used to pick newspapers up off my front lawn, 2 or 3 that I subscribed to. That's all gone. And it was a baseline of knowledge. Doesn't matter how you vote, you all kind of accepted what was in those. If they told you the economy was this, that, or the other, that's how it was. All gone now. We all have our little bubbles, and that includes my followers who get what they like or don't like from me. Everybody else. What is the relationship between what we're talking about with this university educated elitist group of people, and the bubble we're in terms of then just feeding what that little group wants to hear anyway, and then it just gets narrower and narrower? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, Frank, and again, thank you for making those points from the book. Yes, exactly. So again, you have a number of factors that have led to the increasing distrust of traditional news organizations and the increasing partisan and, as you say, advocacy-driven nature of news organizations. The first, which we've talked about, is this new generation, this new cohort of journalists who have come in, certainly in the last 30, 40, even 50 years. Two things I'd say about them. One is, again, they're highly educated, expensively educated. They have a particular, they have a sense of mission, sense of purpose. They don't think it's good enough to tell people what happened. They need to tell people how to think.
Right.
I think Watergate was a key factor, by the way, in transforming journalism in this way. People suddenly came to realize that Watergate, journalists could have these incredibly powerful people who could bring down a president. So I think that led to the influx into the journalism profession of hundreds of thousands, probably over the last 50 or 60 years, of people with a real agenda, with a real commitment, with a real sense of their own power and mission and authority. And I think that's undermined journalism. But a big factor, crucial factor, is this sort of almost technical one, commercial consideration, which has really compounded that problem and has actually made it much worse. Look, newspapers, as you know, and this applies particularly to newspapers, but to some extent to TV news too, but particularly to newspapers. Newspapers, as you know, used to rely for their revenue on advertising. Back in the 2000s, as recently as 2000, the Wall Street Journal, I'll give you that example, something like 90%, 85, 90% of its total revenues came from advertising. It made billions, certainly hundreds of millions, in excess of $1 billion, certainly in today's money, billions from advertising. People, and that's how it works. Papers, Journal reached 2 million people. New York Times at that stage maybe reached 1.5 million people. Advertisers wanted to put their products in front of those, really often, especially the Journal, the Times, quite affluent, well-educated people with lots of disposable income. They would pay a fortune to do that. The advertisers didn't really care what the content was, as long as it wasn't defamatory, as long as it wasn't
Right.
offensive, as long as it wasn't, in some way, wildly inappropriate, or certainly as long as it wasn't injurious to them directly, they didn't mind. They just wanted a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal. You'd pay, tens of thousands, again in today's money, probably $100,000 for, because you wanted to reach that audience. That was where the money came from. That left the editors of the news organizations, of the newspapers, largely free to pursue their own journalism and to do journalism, whether it offended one side or the other side of the political spectrum didn't matter. Beginning in 2000, with the advent of of Google and then later Facebook, advertising, and obviously the consumption of news and information online, advertising migrated en masse to those digital outlets. So again, for what I can speak very personally and directly about the Wall Street Journal, we don't talk about, I don't think we've released these figures publicly, but between 2000 and 2010, that dramatic period when all of that change went on, when people, when advertising went to Google and Facebook, journal advertising declined by something like 75%. Journal revenue declined by something like 75%. So same I know is true for the New York Times, Washington Post. All the major newspapers suffered a collapse in their advertising revenue. Now, when that revenue is 80, 90% of your total revenue, that's an extinction event. That's an extinction level event for a news organization, and its revenue disappears like that. What happened is what we did, and we were the first to do it at the Journal. Others then copied us. We very clever, and again, I collect no credit whatsoever for me. My bosses, very clever, much smarter business people than I, realize that what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to replace it. If we're either going to disappear or dramatically shrink, or we're going to have to replace that revenue from somewhere. And the way to replace that revenue, it came from digital subscriptions. Initially, if you remember, when the internet started, not the Journal, but most news organizations initially put their content out for free. The Journal didn't.
And the Journal went right away to a subscription base.
Right from the start, and then others followed over, 5-10 years later.
Yeah.
And over time, that's the good news for newspapers is that subscription revenue has replaced almost all of the advertising revenue that was lost, and there's still a little bit of advertising revenue too. So the Wall Street Journal right now is in better shape financially than it's been for years. Significant revenue, significant profit. The New York Times, the numbers are all a bit fuzzy, but the New York Times claims something like 6 or 7 million subscribers now, whereas at its peak in the glory days of print, it had maybe 1.5 million. So its total subscriptions are dramatically higher. The revenues are a little bit different because not everybody pays a full subscription rate, but they've replaced most of that revenue that they've lost on advertising with subscription revenue. The key factor, though, Frank, and this is where your point comes in, is that in doing that, they now produce a product which they sell, which the content of which they sell essentially they sell directly to their audience, to their readers. Revenue comes from people who are paying $300, $400, $500 a year, whatever it may be, for the paper, to read stuff. And what that means is those people are very sensitive to what they read. And if they don't like what they read, if they think, and this happens all the time at the New York Times, I should say again, and I don't want to keep sort of sounding like the Wall Street Journal is the good boy here, but actually because the Journal's news coverage, it tends to be heavily business oriented, it's not as susceptible to this. But the Times, and don't take my word for it, take the word of James Bennett, who wrote this very, very interesting long piece in The Economist just over the Christmas holidays. He describes exactly this phenomenon that something like, and I think I'm quoting his numbers correctly in the article he wrote. The new subscribers to the Times, as they came on board and provided all this to the Times, was something like 90% Democrats, and in most of them quite left-wing, quite left-wing Democrats. So they were subscribing to the Times not for a kind of dispassionate series of reporting and comment and analysis and commentary on what's going on in the world. They wanted to hear what they wanted to hear and read what they wanted to read. That Donald Trump is an evil person. That Well,
they were approaching it like people sign on Facebook groups.
The country was profoundly racist. So they wanted to hear it. So that created its own incentive, an additional incentive to this crew of journalists who already believed most of this stuff anyway, already subscribed to this ideology in the first place. It made them even more inclined to do that kind of journalism because there was a commercial incentive for them to do it. And that is exactly what has happened to American newspapers, particularly the New York Times, but others too. They've become these organizations largely staffed by a sort of radical, progressive crowd, way removed from the kind of the mainstream of American American politics, and they are read by, and their revenues are supplied by, their wages are paid by
Hmm.
6, 7, 8 million people who are exactly in that, or in exactly the same political silo. So
Yeah, so it becomes
that's
a
the
closed
problem.
loop with a monetary interest.
Yeah, exactly.